But when I wrote the book, I was of the opinion that carbohydrates were not great for humans and was sort of looking at the literature differently. And over time, I learned personally in my own life, doing a carnivore diet of meat, organs, and fat and salt for a year and a half, that including carbohydrates in my diet improved my health from there.
Why did Paul Saladino quit his carnivore diet and now eats 300 grams of carbs per day? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome back to another Reacts video. Now, Paul Saladino is a massive internet YouTube influencer in the low-carb, keto, carnivore space. And I really didn't know who he was, honestly, until recently. I'm a researcher, having done research on a low-carb, high-fat diet, which is now called keto, but I use real foods. I don't have biohacks and add in all these new internet frills that have no basis in science for the most part. I was, kind of shocked and pleasantly surprised to see the rise of internet keto, and I think that happened for lots of different things. Products that were coming out, the science that we did to support the basis of low-carb diets helped, I think. We were part of the research that started that 2003-2004 Atkins diet craze, if you remember back to that era. So Paul Saladino, best I can tell, is a psychiatrist and started popularizing a carnivore diet. You have to, again, consider the source. And as an internal medicine doctor myself, I really didn't get a whole lot of training in nutrition and weight loss, for that matter. I went out to get special training. Ended up being the president of the Obesity Medicine Association, which is the largest group of medical weight loss doctors in the world. And so I had to teach myself nutrition and teach myself the weight loss and then go to a meeting of thousands of other doctors where we had presentations and all this. Best I can tell, Dr. Saladino sort of comes up with his own ideas, and yet was massively popular and that's all well and good, but I need a little more backing, and if something works for me, I'm not going to be telling everyone else they need to do it, or I need other science behind it. But so, given that he was so influential, I thought it was interesting to read and hear why he quit a carnivore diet. If you haven't heard about a carnivore diet, I've done several videos on that and several Reacts videos, and it can be a healthy way of eating, I think, although I can't really promote it or as a policy recommend it because there aren't many scientific studies behind it. And I prefer if there are randomized trials or really sound studies following people doing a certain dietary pattern. Our randomized trials were done in the early 2000s, back in that 2003-2004 Atkins craze. So this is a video, why Paul Saladino quit carnivore, and it's an interview with Tom DeLauer. Tom is also a YouTube influencer in this space.
But I think the biggest thing for me that I've changed my mind on since I wrote the book in 2019 was carbohydrates, and then in connecting with that, the ketosis and ketogenic diets. So when I wrote the Carnivore Code, and this is humbling, this is what we all do, is we write books and then you put your thoughts into cement, you freeze your thoughts in kryptonite, and then you change your thoughts and you think, oh, the book, it's just not a living document. But when I wrote the book, I was of the opinion that carbohydrates were not great for humans and was sort of looking at the literature differently. And over time, I learned personally in my own life, doing a carnivore diet of meat, organs, and fat and salt for a year and a half, that including carbohydrates in my diet improved my health from there. So my whole story is that I was eating kind of a paleo diet, had really bad eczema, which I'd had my whole life. Getting rid of vegetables and all plant food significantly improved the eczema, so much so that in the last 4.5, 5 years since I've been on this more specific path, I haven't had any flares of the eczema that are significant at all. That was a big deal because I had massive eczema on my elbows, my wrists, my hips, so much so that I really couldn't even wear pants easily. It would get on my shirts. I couldn't do jujitsu because I had eczema on my knees and it was getting infected. So getting rid of vegetables really helped with my eczema. But then I learned after a year and a half that I was getting...
So sounds like he got into it because of his own personal experience, which is very common. A lot of doctors have a weight loss story and then they write a book about weight loss or go into the weight loss field. and that's fine. And so his story, apparently he had a skin condition called eczema, which can be disfiguring and itchy and uncomfortable. Same with psoriasis. It's a condition that is itching and thought to be, both of these are thought to be from inflammation. And cutting carbohydrates out, including vegetables have carbohydrates, can reduce the inflammation, and there might even be a specific factor in the vegetables that cause the reaction. Don't know in his case, but I've seen this before, and there are very little studies published on this, but it's pretty common to have someone get resolution of psoriasis or eczema, a skin condition that has been difficult to treat, and they can treat it or reverse it by just changing the food, which is another reason why considering a low-carb or keto lifestyle may be beneficial for medical reasons, for weight loss, but also other medical issues that have been unable to be fixed or treated well by the medical mainstream. So he got into this because of fixing a eczema problem that he had.
Such bad muscle cramps, heart palpitations, sleep disturbances. My testosterone was kind of going down. Right now it's around 700 or 800. I've included carbohydrates in my diet for the last 2.5 years, but at that point it was going 450, 500, it was significantly lower, and my sex hormone binding globulin was creeping up. So I had electrolyte issues. And what I realized was that I'd been thinking about insulin wrong. I'd been thinking that I needed to keep my insulin low all of the time. And to be fair, on a carnivore diet, my fasting insulin was low, 3.5, 3.0. And I thought incorrectly that if I ate carbohydrates, my insulin would spike and that would be a bad thing, right? What I realized, and I wasn't taught this in medical school, was that insulin spikes after you eat carbohydrates are actually healthy for the human body for a variety of reasons. So insulin is probably something else I've changed my mind on, carbohydrates and insulin. What I realize now is that your body needs an insulin signal after a meal when you eat carbohydrates to signal to the kidneys to resorb and hold on to minerals, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. So the massive, profound electrolyte problems that people get on long-term ketogenic diets are almost certainly due to a lack of insulin signaling at the level of the kidney. There are various levels of kidney physiology upon which insulin is going to act, but people in the ketogenic space, I think, are well-intentioned and they're trying to hold on to minerals by including massive amounts of salt in their diet, but it just doesn't work because you need an insulin signal at the level of the kidney to hold on to those things.
So hang on. I've reviewed a couple of Dr. Saladino's videos before, one on iron, and he was thinking that he was iron overloaded based on a ferritin level, and he mentions testosterone and SHBG, and so sex hormone binding globulin. I have to think that there may be an overreaction here to what is just a different metabolic state. Comparing your blood levels to people who eat carbohydrates, we know, is fraught with problems. The ketone level may be elevated, but with people who don't eat carbohydrates, they don't have ketones. So ketone elevation is abnormal? Well, no, not if you're in nutritional ketosis. Back to this electrolyte thing. So my teacher, Steve Finney, who is really the godfather, or if you will, of nutritional ketosis and the keto diet, he was studying the keto diet with his bikers in the 1980s, way before I started looking into this around the year 2000 or 1998. And so what I was taught is that when you're keto adapted, when you're a fat burner, you need to have 5 to 7 grams of salt per day. And that may seem like a lot of salt compared to a lot of people who are told to restrict salt. So not only in a low-carb keto diet, in our keto, he called it keto people. It's funny. We tell people to eat fat and we tell people to have more salt. And you can get salt in the food with the salt shaker. You can get it in electrolyte packs and all that. And then I think he's talking about muscle cramps that can happen if you're doing extreme exercise. Well, that's a different situation. If you're in one of my clinic patients, most of my clinic patients can't even get out and exercise. because of the medical issues or the obesity. So we're talking about using a therapeutic tool in a medical situation. That's what I'm using. Or now here we're talking about optimizing your athletic performance, for example, and getting muscle cramps, for example, when you're running. So these are different situations. Trying to apply nutritional ketosis in both contexts may not or may require a little tweaking. It sounds to me like adding more electrolytes is, in my teaching, is what you just have to do. In fact, having carbs may conversely make you hold on to the electrolytes too much. Putting it, not it's right or wrong, it's just that you're holding on to the salt and electrolytes too much, maybe even causing high blood pressure when you're eating carbs and your insulin's holding on to the sodium. So short of studies that are directly addressing this issue, I think it's a stretch to generalize in what he's saying. But if you're doing a keto diet, you're keto adapted, you feel great, you want to not only use it for weight loss but weight maintenance, then be sure you're getting lots of salt. And 5 to 7 grams is something you can aim for the day.
So the first thing I did when I sort of transitioned off a ketogenic, zero carb, quote unquote, carnivore diet was include honey in my diet. And the first couple of days I felt a little weird because I was physiologically insulin resistant. And then your body kind of adjusts to this, my blood sugar spikes normalize. And if I eat honey today or a few years ago after I had adjusted to having the carbohydrates back in my diet, my blood sugar might go to 130, 140, 150 milligrams per deciliter. But I don't worry about that because if you look at the actual shape of that curve, it comes back down to a baseline very quickly, within the hour for sure. So this is normal human physiology, and we should not fear glucose spikes in a metabolically healthy individual.
So this is fascinating. Again, consider the source. We were all taught in medical school, and if you did an internal medicine residency, Dr. Saladino did not, we're taught that if you eat carbohydrates, the blood glucose goes up and the insulin goes up to lower the blood glucose. And he calls that normal, but normal is not necessarily optimal. And through the years, looking at the glucose and insulin, it's the multiplication product of those two, the glucose and insulin, that gives you an idea of risk of the insulin resistance. It's called the HOMA, homeostatic model. And so I guess I'm seeing that Dr. Saladino is taking a step back toward the teaching that he had, that this is normal, so it's fine, when we might actually be able to do better. Normal may not be optimal. And I'm getting the sense that he was a little freaked out by the blood tests that weren't right. I'm not sure if he felt bad yet.
It's going to go up, it's going to come back down. That's normal, and that insulin signaling is healthy for humans at so many levels. It's healthy for our hormones, it's healthy for our brains, it's healthy for the production of glutathione and the resorption of minerals. So that idea of insulin being all bad all the time and including carbohydrates in my diet, that was a huge, huge thing. And now we know, there's tons of research that I just didn't see at that point, that I was sort of blind to, about carbohydrates for athletes, carbohydrates post-exercise. We just worked out. I have holes in my shorts now from the weight belt, and this weight that I was using has ripped a hole in the front of my shorts here. And carbohydrates post-exercise are so clearly shown to improve performance. Carbohydrates overall are shown to improve all sorts of metrics in humans.
So now he's toggling back to the old paradigm, or maybe he always was in the old paradigm, and the old paradigm being that you have to eat carbs before exercise, and that adding carbs, if you're carb adapted, you're a carb eater, you're a carb burner, will help you around exercise. Well, I have no doubt that if you're a carb eater and you need to replenish glycogen storage, for example, the new science, and this is done by Professor Tim Noakes, by Professor Jeff Volek, that shows that actually the body adapts quite well, including muscles, and you don't have to add in the sugar after meals and the sugar after exercise. So it sounds like he's toggling back to that comfort space, and what everyone else is saying, perhaps it can be tough being a leader, taking the arrows, the pioneers take the arrows, the settlers get the land, is the old saying Steve Finney taught me. So he may have been tired of taking these arrows, or maybe there was something with his health. I haven't really heard that yet.
Testosterone, recovery, sleep, all kinds of things. So those are two big ones for me from the outset.
Now, on the cramping side, I've got a question. As far as, because I've experienced that when I'm low carb, right? I'm very, very prone to cramping, which as someone that does a lot of endurance stuff, it's problematic. Like if I'm backcountry or anything like that. I was just doing a long trek and ran into a huge cramping issue, even though I'm not super low carb anymore. I guess I'd still lowish carb. And I would argue that it actually takes time to actually like recover from some of that insulin issue that you have with the kidneys. But the question that I've always had, and maybe you know the answer, since protein is insulinogenic, can you get some resorption of the minerals through the insulin spike with protein, or does the glucagon cancel that out in that case?
I mean, you get some, it's just nowhere near. If you look at the amount of insulin and the level of insulin you get with carbohydrates, it's much higher than it is with just protein. I mean, you get some with protein, it's just not the same as a carbohydrate spike. And so people in communities that are fearful of carbohydrates will say, look at how much insulin you're getting. And that's good, you know, you need that.
I'm not so convinced. And he really didn't answer the question as to how much that difference makes in terms of resorbing salt. Did you see that? It was, yes, it's a different level of insulin, but what is the effect on the kidney? I thought that was a great question. And remember, these guys are talking about pretty extreme exercise. I'm not even sure what backcountry necessarily means. I guess you're out there running somewhere and have no one else to go to or talk to. So if you're not exercising to that level, I've seen no concerns here. And I still don't know why he stopped, physically.
So people understand this also, like when you don't eat carbohydrates, you become insulin resistant. This is not the pathological insulin resistance of diabetes, which is different physiology that I can describe. This is the insulin resistance of physiology, basically historically, evolutionarily, this is starvation insulin resistance, meaning that you are physiologically insulin resistant. Your body is saying, hey, spare the glucose, any glucose you're getting, spare that for the brain, the adrenals, and the gonads, and maybe the red blood cells. Don't put it in the muscles. That's physiologic insulin resistance, and that's what you see in people who are low carb or zero carb or keto, and that's why the first time someone like that eats carbohydrates, they may feel very strange, or the blood sugar may go up. This is why a woman who is low carb will fail a glucola test in her pregnancy, because that is physiologic insulin resistance.
Well, I don't like that term, insulin resistance. I never have. It's high insulin levels cause the body not to react to insulin as well. And if you're not eating carbohydrates, you don't need much insulin around. And the idea then that you would take a glucola, that's a test, like a glucose tolerance test, to see if you can bring the insulin up to keep the blood glucose down. It's a way to diagnose gestational diabetes. Why would you give someone glucose when they're not eating glucose and expect a normal response? That's actually been worked out at a meeting by Ben Bickman. He talked about how it takes the pancreas just a little time to be able to get back to be able to respond to that, to me, that insult of carbs coming in. So again, I'm not sure why he stopped.
And I actually have come to believe that's not a good thing. I don't think we want to be physiologically insulin resistant. It is a historically, evolutionarily adaptive thing for extreme situations.
Have you noticed that there's a lot of good and bad? Like good, bad, not much gray in the middle? I don't know. A lot of it's pretty judgy, isn't he?
But I think that humans do better, and I've come to see carbohydrates as a signal of abundance. I mean, if you go to spend time with the Hadza or the Maasai or the Samburu or the Khoisan, I mean, these tribes invariably seek carbohydrates and they celebrate it. They don't think, oh, I've had 100 carbs today already, I'm not going to eat this. When I was with the Hadza, we found a beehive and they just went off on this thing. I mean, I got a big chunk of beehive and ate it with the larva in there and the honey, and it's amazing. And the three Hadza guys that I was with were probably ate 60, 70% of the honey in this hive, and then shared a little bit with their comrades when they came back. Say, hey, we found a hive, here's a small amount for you guys. But they'd eaten a ton of this stuff. So historically, I think humans had massive exposure to carbohydrates whenever they could get it, as much as they could get it.
Yeah.
They didn't fear it at all.
Well, I got to admire him to seek out information on his own and try to solve what is a complicated issue by his own experience, and to generalize to humans do better. This is a tough video, because I think Dr. Saladino has done a lot of good in promoting lower carb types of diets, and while he might not feel comfortable anymore doing it, I really haven't seen any data yet to tell me that he had less performance, or maybe he just feels better, which would be great. But the idea that insulin is necessary, Tom DeLauer's question about protein raising insulin is spot on, because it does. In fact, insulin helps amino acids, or the protein building blocks, get into the cells. That's probably what its real role is, according to some experts who think it's not really been designed to help glucose in the cells. It's more to help amino acids in the cells. But again, that's wild speculation. I guess you could do a study to try to figure that out. But the idea of going to populations that to modern day, therefore the world has always been this way, that's fraught with difficulty. The introduction of modern foods changes once you observe these folks, that it changes things, and I just don't know enough to comment on the vast human experience, other than I visited a group north of Vancouver who really hadn't had many carbohydrates, the First Nations groups up there, and the idea that when you bring in a Western food, or you bring in a snowmobile, for example, they're not going to go back to the dog sleds, and the type of foods and addictive nature of food can bring down native populations like that pretty quickly. So I'm still kind of wondering why he quit the diet.
I would agree. I mean, I definitely feel like, to say that carbohydrates aren't evolutionarily correct is invalid. I mean, I think there's always access to them at some point, one way or another. So
humans are seeking them. If we don't have them, we're seeking them. If we can't find them in berries, I didn't mean to cut you off, but if we can't find them in berries, if we can't find them in honey, we're going to find them in roots. Yeah. It's a piece. Just like, I mean, it's interesting. It's just so intuitive and simple. We're looking for animal protein. We're looking for nutrients and organs. That's clear. We're always eating the whole animal. But the next thing, I think, in tandem with that, we're also seeking carbohydrates as wild humans. We've forgotten what wild humans look like, because we all, except for maybe a couple thousand people on the planet today, live as semi-domesticated humans. But it's very clear. I mean, if you look at the Hadza, so there was a PhD researcher who actually spent a lot of time with them and gave them surveys of these nomadic tribes and said, what are your favorite foods? And there were 5 foods that were their favorite. So there was meat, there were berries, there was baobab, there was tubers, and I forget the last one, I'll think of it in a moment. But honey was invariably the first thing that they wanted. Both men and women ranked honey as number 1. And men said meat as number 2. Women ranked berries, baobab, and tubers, I think all about the same. But in both groups, the roots were sort of the last thing that they wanted to eat.
Wow, man, that's wild.
But both of them really, that was the favorite thing for them, was honey.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. It's delicious.
They celebrated it more than anything, right? And if you look at these people, there are tons of studies of them, of their cardiovascular health. They have insulin sensitivity, which is amazing, which is exemplary. They're not insulin resistant. They're not diabetic. They're not obese. So
my own anecdotal experience, I don't eat an abundance of carbohydrates, but I've added honey and fruit in, and my insulin sensitivity has improved on my lab work. So, I mean, it's...
By fasting insulin, which is perhaps the most clear metric you could ever use. That's unquestionably an improvement in insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, so wow, a lot of overgeneralizations and use of their own experience to generalize, although they claim that it's anecdotal. I can see why there's a lot of confusion on the internet that it has to do with low-carb, keto, and carnivore types of diets, and to have Dr. Saladino swing totally back to eating carbs based on a few blood tests. I'm not such a reductionist to think that one lab, they were focusing on the insulin level, fasting insulin is the be-all end-all. I'm not so sure. I mean, the fasting glucose might be a little higher even when you're keto adapted, and the glucose is needed for the blood cells in the bloodstream. I'm not so sure this normal optimal range that you might have found for those who eat carbohydrates is going to be the same range for those who don't eat carbohydrates. That kind of the logic about going to the Hadza tribe, if honey was so great, then they would never eat meat, right? If that really was a sustainable kind of thing. So no, the meat was one of their foods that they required. And one of the nutritional principles were made of protein. So we need protein every day, that you can't just live on honey. I mean, that's basically an energy source. So I mean, a lot of it is kind of all over the place logic that I don't quite follow, but I can kind of see if your moorings aren't solid, you get into a field, you're going to be buffeted around by the winds of change, and so I didn't see anything in here to make me want to change the way I eat. And I don't eat a whole lot of vegetables. I guess I'm almost carnivore. I'm carnivore-like, which is kind of a joke because I panned a lot of videos because they called it keto-like. You know, what does that mean? So, but if you're a patient of mine, I'm not persuaded by anything I saw here. If you're a patient of mine and you're an avid exerciser, I refer my patients to those who are experts in low carb and exercise. So that's Professor Noakes, Professor Volek, the Zach Bitter, who is a ultramarathon champion who uses low carb diets, and fine tune your exercise following those people who have actually done it themselves under the circumstances of low carb diets. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.